When I say Cuba, what comes to mind? You know, a lot of us have our own ideas about what Cuba is all about. We know it's a socialist country, but what do we really know? Well, author and photographer Alex Harris had some ideas of his own, and he went to check it out firsthand. And the photos that came from that search are part of a new book called The Idea of Cuba. And Alex Harris joins us now to talk about this. This is really interesting. Can you first tell us what you're trying to say with this book?
Well, Virginia, I went there as a photographer, not trying to say anything, but trying to see what it was that my pictures could tell me and perhaps tell others about Cuba that we didn't otherwise know. And one of the things I discovered is, as you were saying, we think of Cuba as a socialist country, this communist country. There's really so much that we have in common with the Cuban people. A desire for freedom, education, hard work, sacrifice, a love for family, a love for country. I discovered there's so much more that connects us than separates us.
Now, your book is divided into 3 sections. And you begin with photos that look a lot like this one, where you're taking it through the windshield of automobiles that were sort of abandoned there. 1950s American automobiles, luxury cars that were there when the U.S., when citizens used to go there and gamble and all of that. Can you take us through this one, for example, and what you were thinking when you shot it this way?
What I'm thinking is that we still see Cuba through the lens of the late 50s and the early 60s, and what would it be like to photograph Cuba through that same lens, the lens of the American automobile? And ironically, it's not only the way that we as Americans think of Cuba, but Cubans themselves. These are the predominant cars on the Cuban roads. It's the way they see their own country. So it was really, could I use these pictures as a metaphor for the way that we see Cuba and Cubans see the United States and themselves?
It's interesting. You say this is still the predominant car on the roads. I mean, some of these cars are, what, 50, 60 years old? How do they keep them running?
Well, you know, when I first saw these cars, I felt sorry for the Cubans. I thought, there they are, forced to drive through their country with these symbols of capitalist triumph. But in fact, these cars are really symbols of Cuban ingenuity and hard work. They're filled, they probably don't have an original part left on the inside. They've all been converted. These mechanics know the insides of these cars as well as a great Cuban hero I'm going to talk about, Jose Marti, knew the United States. They know how to keep them running.
And for example, what are we looking at here in terms of why did you shoot it this way and looking at this panorama?
What we're looking at, it's so interesting. So this is a late 50s American car. On the left-hand side, you see the buildings that the Russians built with the height of the Russian aid to Cuba in the 70s and particularly in the early 80s. And on the right, you see the buildings the Russians abandoned when they left because there was no money to complete them, and they're still standing there unfinished.
That is interesting, actually, because some people may not remember that when the Soviet bloc fell, that affected Cuba greatly, right, economically?
It affected Cuba in a way that it's hard for us to imagine in this country. The year that the Soviets left, within 1 year, I've heard the statistic that the average caloric intake of a Cuban went down about 30%.
Wow.
So I think it was, we think of our Depression, our Great Depression, it was more of an impact than that.
Now, I want to talk about this photo specifically. You have a section in there. There are statues, busts, figures of Jose Marti all over. Can you explain the significance of him for people who don't know Cuban history and why there are statues everywhere and what people think of that?
You know, we don't really have a figure like Marti in the United States. He's kind of part Abraham Lincoln, part Martin Luther King, the authority of Moses, throw in a few dashes of Walt Whitman. That's Jose Marti for Cubans. He lived most of his life in exile in the United States. He was fighting against Spain, against the Spain domination of Cuba. And he wrote about what it was that would make Cuba the ideal nation. And those ideas are at the heart of, I would argue, every Cuban's experience, because his statues are everywhere, Cubans read his words, and his sayings are everywhere in Cuba. So ironically, one of the things that he fought the most against was racial prejudice in Cuba and racial prejudice. He'd seen what had happened in the United States during the Jim Crow era. Here's a photograph with Marti's statue looming over this game of soccer. Take a look at who's actually playing the game and who isn't. And you wonder whether the kind of racial harmony that's spoken about by the Castro regime and others in Cuba really exists.
And we should point out Marti was a figure that was alive in the late 1800s. He died in 1895, so this is many years before Fidel Castro came to power. How does the government reconcile that? You know, he fought for Cuban independence from Spain. And the statues are everywhere, and they've been allowed to sort of stay everywhere.
Yeah.
Is there any contradiction between the socialist republic that it is and then the idea of Martí, who wanted independence and freedom?
You know, when Castro came into Havana in 1959, he proclaimed, "This time the revolution is for real." And what everyone knew he meant is, this time finally the ideas of Jose Martí are going to be realized. And I can't myself say whether he originally intended those ideas to be fully realized. But Martí very specifically wrote that under socialism, the Cuban people would be slaves of the state. There's certain ideas that Martí stood for: equality, education, other things that have really been realized by Castro's revolution, and others that are absolutely paradoxical, like a lack of freedom of the press and freedom of speech.
And yet Martí is such a beloved figure, so respected, that it would almost be foolish to try to tear these down, because the people, as you mentioned, he's pretty much everything. You know, Abraham Lincoln, little Walt Whitman, Martin Luther King Jr. This one, I think, is a picture that you mentioned is unique and sort of touches you because of the juxtaposition here. What were you seeing when you took this?
Well, you know, Martí really felt that Cubans should love family and country with kind of equal fervor. And as I made this picture, though, I noticed something else, and particularly when I looked at it later, that everyone seems to be waiting. There's a kind of lethargic, restless waiting here with the people on the street. And that was my sense, both that they were literally waiting here in this picture for something, but in a larger sense, the Cuban people, I think, are still waiting for Martí's ideas to be realized.
Do you think that at some point they'll get tired of waiting and try to rush the process along?
Well, it's hard to know what that would mean if they got tired of waiting, but my sense is that, as we were talking about in the beginning, there's so much that we think of Cubans as being different than us, and they want many of the same things that we do for their families and for their country.
Now, the final section of your book goes through and shows images that are similar to this one. Can you tell us what these photos are about? You
know, when Castro came to power in '59, there were 40,000 prostitutes in Havana. Within 2 years, prostitution didn't exist. Imagine if in 1964 Lyndon Johnson declared a war on poverty. For 30 years there was no poverty. All of a sudden poverty came back 30 years later. We would think that's significant. Well, when I got to Cuba, originally in 1998, there were prostitutes all over Cuba, and so that was significant. I made portraits of these young women, really as a way of looking at some of the contradictions of the society.
Were you struck by anything about them in terms of things they might have had in common, or the fact that there was such a wide range, or anything specific about who they are and sort of what it says about the society as a whole right now?
Well, first of all, you know, as in this picture, I really tried to photograph these young women not as examples of a profession, but as individuals. And maybe I'm just another man guilty of idealizing Cuban women, but I felt like these were strong, independent, beautiful women who were who had families, who had sisters and mothers, and sisters, as in this case, who were really trying, and they had the responsibility of feeding their families. When the Soviets left in 1998, essentially the economy collapsed, and the Cuban government made a decision that they were going to stay afloat with tourism. And with tourism, prostitution came back. So it really is really a symbol of where the revolution has gone, the kind of compromises that have been made for political power.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I just want to ask one final question. As people look at these photos and read your observations in the book, I know you are not trying specifically to send any kind of message other than what the pictures will say, but what are you hoping people might come away with? I'm
hoping that people will get a sense that Cuba's not what we think it is, it's not what we think it was, that the Cuban people are, I think, ready for change, but I think they also have an independent streak. They have a pride, and I think we can't know what the future is going to bring, but that Cuba and the United States are tied together, and they will be tied more closely in the future. And it'll be interesting to see what happens, of course, as the political landscape changes there. Alex Harris, thank you so much for sharing your insights. The book is called The Idea of Cuba. Check it out.